Good morning. There are many faces I recognize, several people that I know. It's always good to be back and see you guys. I brought my wife with me. I think the last 2 times I've been here, I talked about my wife, but there was no proof that she existed, so she's here. We brought my wife is named Emma. I'm Joe. My wife is Emma. We brought our daughter Ellie and our son Micah. Ellie's 2 and Micah is 6 months old. So they keep our lives busy and our hands full. I have met many of you, recognize a lot of the others, but I just want to introduce myself to those that I've not met before. I'm from Texas. Well, I'm from the South, mostly Texas. My wife's from here in Illinois. We were doing ministry down in Texas, and when we found out we were going to have Ellie, that kind of ministry was winding down. So we said, God, where would you have us go? What would you have us do? So we eventually settled here in Bloomington and just really are not content with the state of the gospel on the western side of town. When we began researching the area and when we moved here, we realized the churches, the evangelical churches in particular, are primarily on the eastern side of Main Street in Bloomington and Normal. So we moved to that side of town. I worked overnight at Walmart. I still work there 2 nights a week. Now I'm a personal trainer. And so that gives us a little more flexibility, just both for taking care of the family, doing ministry, kind of settling in here. So we just moved here as missionaries to the western side of town. The work is really slow right now, to be honest. There's little glimmers here, little glimmers there, but the work is just kind of slow. And so we're just trusting God that He's the one in charge of the speed. We're the ones just obeying Him and following Him as disciples. Clark always asks me to preach on fun and long passages of Scripture. Last time I was here, he asked me to do an overview of the book of Leviticus, which I think was a good opportunity for me, and I think a good opportunity for you. Today he asked me to preach an overview of the Sermon on the Mount, but really focus in on something in particular that speaks to me, and I think that speaks to us in our situation. Before we jump in to our passage, Matthew 5, I wanted to tell you, whenever we go anywhere, of course, we've kind of had to get to know this area because she's from South Central or Central Southern Illinois, I think she would tell me. So we both had to kind of learn this area. And whenever we go anywhere, we have different methods of getting there. I don't know if you guys have that problem in your house. I get in the car and I'm like, well, I've never been down this road before. It could be faster. And so I'll often we'll hop in and we'll start going somewhere and I'll have to turn around later, or, we hit a lot more traffic lights than we thought we were going to hit, and so it didn't end up any faster. And so my wife is always like, okay, we got in the car, we're going somewhere, let's just get there. The most direct route is the best one, let's go that way. And so I will say that I have grown, and so that in many cases I will now go the direct route. But we've learned that we've started seeing Ellie as she's learned to talk. She is our 3rd driver in the car because now she says, go, Daddy, whenever the light turns green. So now we have all these drivers in our car. But one of the things that I noticed is that even though we have different methods for getting places, we never really have an argument about where we're going. There's no question about, well, I wanted to go to this restaurant, you wanted to go to this restaurant, we're kind of in, we just disagree on how to get there. I want to take the scenic route, she wants to just get there and start eating. And I wonder if that happens in your house, if there are some areas where the question isn't, oh, well, we have different goals here. We just go about doing it in a different way. I think a lot of the time, actually not a lot of the time, I've heard and I believe that a lot of fights in marriage come over finances. But I don't think it's because people have different goals. It's just about different ways of getting there. No one's going to say, I don't want financial security. I don't want to save some more. I don't want to. It's just a different, well, if we go this way, then we'll get there faster. Or if we go this way, we'll enjoy the route a little bit more. And that shows up in other areas. It shows up in how we take care of our kids. We all have goals. We want well-adjusted, obedient kids. I think we have a fussy baby right now. We just have different methods of getting there. And what we're going to look at today in the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus is preaching to a huge crowd, but in particular to the small group of men gathered around him. And he starts saying stuff that everybody in the audience is going to agree with. But he says, we're going to get there, and the way I'm telling you to go is in a different way. And he starts telling the disciples, I'm not telling you to go for different goals than the goals that you have. But along the road, you're going to think, well, I want to go this way. This is going to be the best method for me to get there. And Jesus is going to say, no, we're going this way. I want you to go this other route because my route is better. So turn with me to Matthew chapter 5. The Sermon on the Mount, we see a form of that again later in the book of Luke. And we see some of the things Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount several times. And that's because unless somebody asks an itinerant preacher to preach on a specific topic, they might have a favorite sermon that they preach there. And so Jesus had certain things that he wanted people to hear, and so he would repeat those several times. The Sermon on the Mount is Matthew 5 through 7. We're just going to read verses 1 through 12 today. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Notice the shift here. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your word, and I thank you that in words we've heard many times, we can see them in a new light, and we can see you calling to us in discipleship. Amen. The book of Matthew was written by Matthew, a Jew, former Jewish tax collector, and he was writing to his people, and he was saying to them, this is the promised Messiah that God has sent. This is the King. This is God himself. We've got to follow him. We've got to turn and follow him. And the book alternates a sermon and then Jesus' actions, and then a sermon and then Jesus' actions. And it uses a lot of quotations from the Old Testament to say, the one that was promised, this is him. So we see, like in the birth account, there's lots of, this was to fulfill the words that said, this was to fulfill. So we get to the Sermon on the Mount, the longest sermon that we have that Jesus preached. And this is the authoritative message of the Messiah. This is his whole message kind of all together, all at once. And the beginning of it, the Beatitudes, it's really the essence of the sermon, kind of. This is the theme, and I'm going to talk about this in a lot of different ways. And then he moves on into a section, and he talks about his kingdom, the Messianic kingdom, in relationship to the law. Well, if we're going to follow you, what does that have to do with the law that we've been following our whole lives? Then Jesus starts to work out, well, what does this look like in the real world? What is the practical outworkings of discipleship here? And then he finishes with a warning and says, you're either with me or you're against me. We know these as the Beatitudes. One of my coworkers that I've been praying for, and I've shared with you about him, and you've prayed for him, was asking me what I was preaching on today. I asked him to join me, but he decided not to. And I jumped into this. I said, the Beatitudes. And I was like, well, I need to really explain that. And he goes, oh, I've heard of those. And then when I started explaining what they were, he's like, oh, okay, so that's what this thing I've heard of is. It comes from a Latin word that, if I pronounce it, I'll kind of butcher it. But it means blessed, and Jesus is saying, this is the good life. If you're going to do something, if you're going to pursue something, this is what you should go for. It's kind of a commendation. And we see the closest equivalent we have to that would probably be in college graduation ceremonies, where somebody who's usually really rich and really famous gets up and starts saying, hey, this is what you need to do in life to have a successful life. And Jesus is using this blessed, this happy, this commendation word. And he walks through here. And one of the coolest things about this to me, because I think this is where it really highlights what's important, is that it uses a form that says blessed, and then it says for theirs. There's a couple Greek words in that second part, but the whole way down, and in our translations, I'm reading the ESV, they translate it a few different ways to help make it a little bit more clear. There's nothing wrong with that. That helps make it good and clear. But when I looked at it and realized every one of them has the same form, and if we look at a whole column, we see, well, I wouldn't disagree with anything in that second column. Because he says, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Everybody there on that mountain, just local people who heard about this preacher and come to hear him, they would say, yeah, we want the kingdom of heaven. For they shall be comforted. Yeah, I'd like to be comforted. Life's been difficult. I think we would say, yeah, I would like comfort. We pursue that in a few different ways. For they shall inherit the earth. They're the people who rule. They're the people in charge. They're the successful people that everyone looks up to. They shall be satisfied. I think he's talking about more than just a physical satisfaction. He's saying they're the ones who get what they want. So we start looking down that list, and everybody in the audience would say, yeah, they shall receive mercy. Yeah, I want to receive mercy because I know I blow it. For they shall see God. They shall be called sons of God, which is they're identified with, these are God's people. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So we look down that list and go, yeah, I agree. That's what I want. Jesus is saying, here's the good life. All of us here agree. Comfort, getting the things that we want in life, inheriting the earth, the kingdom. This is the good life. And so everybody kind of leans in as they're hearing this. But then they start to remember, oh yeah, before he said that, he said that. I wouldn't really go that way. And what Jesus is doing here, he's calling the crowd, and he's calling us to pursue the good life by embracing need instead of pursuing fullness. He's calling them to desire what's best instead of what seems right at the moment. And then he's saying, pursue the good life by identifying with me. This is discipleship in a nutshell. Instead of trying to be rich and full and proud and settled, pursue need. Instead of going for the things that you feel like you want right now, desire what's best. But above all, Jesus is saying, you've got to identify with me. And we see that again in the Sermon on the Mount. And what's interesting about these Beatitudes, we're going to jump into them here in just a second, is that they contrast really well with Jesus preaching to the Pharisees in Luke 11. It's not a one-for-one comparison, but you can kind of look down the Beatitudes and say, Jesus is saying the good life is over here. This is what you want. And then if we look at where Jesus is condemning the Pharisees, condemning the Jewish leaders, he's condemning them for this whole laundry list of things that stand against what we've seen in the Beatitudes. And when we listen to this sermon, as we go through here, we've got to remember, Jesus is actually preaching, even though there's a lot of people on the mountain, he's preaching to his disciples right there. Guys who have already left everything to follow him. Guys who've already said, you know what, the life I'm living and the life that I am pursuing is not worth it to me. I'll leave everything behind and follow Jesus. And so he's preaching this to them. Verse 3, starting verse 3 through 5, he's calling them to embrace their need. And we see, blessed are the poor in spirit. I've heard the Beatitudes all my life and never really thought they were particularly deep. Didn't really know what there was in that for me. But I was reading this and studying this and seeing he's saying, blessed are the spiritually poor, as opposed to the spiritually proud. The guys who are like, I did it all right. I've got everything together. And I don't know about you, but more often than not, I end up in the category of the spiritually poor, but I want to be in the category of the spiritually proud. Because I feel like if I get all this stuff right, then God will answer my prayers. If I'm a good husband and a good father and a good missionary and I work hard and do all this stuff. But Jesus is saying, blessed are the spiritually poor. The people who come and say, you know what? My hands are empty. I have nothing to bring. And Jesus says, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He says, blessed are those who mourn. He's not just saying, blessed are those who have had family members die and who have struggled. And he's saying, blessed are those who mourn spiritually, who mourn over their own sin, mourn over the wickedness in the world around them. Because he's not saying, hey, let's make life more difficult enough that you are in mourning all the time. But he's saying, blessed are those who recognize what's happening in them and around them and mourn over that. And I said that he was talking to his disciples. What really strikes me in this sermon is that he's saying, guys, you've got to continue the way you started. Because for you and I to start with Christ, we have to mourn over our sin and say, you know what? I come empty-handed. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Instead of the American value of doing everything for yourself so that you have comfort. I have a friend who was 29 and was working for one time said he was working for retirement, saving up money so that he could retire and things would be great. We have this idea that, well, if we get enough money or get to a certain point, then we'll be in comfort. And Jesus is saying the ones who find comfort are those who mourn over their own sin and the sin in the world around them. I would say spiritually poor is like this upward poverty, embracing need. Mourning is, to me, an inward poverty, embracing need. And then in verse 5 he says, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And that, to me, is an outward poverty. I always thought meek meant mousy. And that definitely stands against everything we as Americans are about. But that's not actually what he's talking about at all. He's saying, blessed are those who aren't absorbed in this sense of, I am so important. And because I'm so important, I'm going to exert my energy on the world and form everything to the way I want it. And I think this shows up, in a few different ways. And we'll start far away and then get a little closer to ourselves. Reality television, to me, is the opposite of meek. Because it's to think that somehow brushing my teeth is important enough for everybody else to pay attention to. We've got all sorts of people that think that. Christians, non-Christians, everybody thinks that if I am on, everybody else should see what's going on in my life. I'm sure money is some kind of a motivation. If they offered you $50,000 to just videotape your life for a week, you'd think hard about it. I wouldn't do it because of so many divorces that happen after reality TV shows. But I think it's the opposite of meek because it's thinking, I'm so important, everybody else needs to see what's happening in my life. A little closer to home, I've started recently, I was really thinking about it last night at work, to think that Facebook has really caused us to embrace the opposite of meek. I joined Facebook when it was only for college students back in my senior year of college, whatever that was. And so 2005, I think it was in the fall. We graduated in 2006. So I joined it way back then and remember thinking, I resisted it for a while. I thought it was stupid. Joined it, was on there for a long time. But eventually I realized, gosh, my posts are about how cool I am and what I think. And that's not something that I really care to spend my time on. I like to see what's happening with my family members and see some pictures from back home and stuff like that. But to think that I'm so important, everybody else should see my thoughts and hear my thoughts, and the election's coming up and I need to post links to my favorite candidates, and I need to tell you the great thing that happened at work that someone said about me. I think that's the opposite of meek. But the really close to home thing for me is the opposite of meek. I think as men, we begin to think that we're so important that everybody at home needs to do everything the way we want it done. I'm speaking off the top of my head, but in 1 Peter, I think, he says, don't be harsh with your wives. And I think he's saying that because men have this temptation to think we are so important that they need to do things our way. I deal with that all the time, thinking, well, I wanted you to do this, why didn't you do that? And the Lord's had to form in me just don't be harsh with your wife. But to stop thinking, well, I'm so important, the way I want things to be done should be how they're done, so everybody needs to do that. Because meek is saying, you know what? It's not, oh, I'm so bad, I'm not important. It's not me at all. Hey, my wife needs something, what can I do? My kids need something, what can I do? A family member on Facebook has said something's going on, let's be excited for them. Meek, because blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. They're the ones that get things their way. Not the ones who are harsh and self-absorbed. The second section of these, in verses 6 through 10, he says, Jesus calls us to pursue the good life by desiring what's best. Verse 6, he says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. I heard somebody say this one time, and I've tried to be informing that in my own walk, that part of being a disciple is not getting to the point where everything is right, but where our desire for hunger, or our desire and hunger for righteousness is greater. We're not supposed to feed people or feed ourselves righteousness to the point where everything is great. He's saying, desire righteousness inside and outside. Let me think how I'm going to put that a better way. The real work is recognizing the lack of righteousness and doing whatever it takes to hunger for it more. Because Jesus says they're the ones who get it. We can hunger and thirst for a lot of other things. But Jesus is saying the ones who hunger and thirst for righteousness get their desire filled. And I don't know about you, but it's easy to start thinking, oh, if I had this or if I had that, if I could give my kids this, which I never saw that coming. Growing up, we didn't really have a whole lot. I remember at times wishing we had more, but for the most part, we had a good life, and I learned that there's worse things in the world than poverty. But now that I've got kids, man, sometimes, especially at Walmart, working there overnight, I see things and they need this, and they need this, and they need this, and oh, I need to get this. Where did that come from? We start to want all of these things we see in catalogs and we see in magazines. But Jesus says it's not the ones who want those things who get satisfied. It's the ones who want righteousness that get satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. It's easy to think, let me say it a different way. It's hard to be merciful if you don't need mercy right now. We have to think a little further down the road to get ready for needing mercy. Because if I don't need mercy right now, and somebody cuts me off in traffic, and I get upset, and I honk my horn and lay on the horn, or if something happens at home and I'm not in need of mercy right now, and so I'm pretty unforgiving about something, then the situation is completely different if I realize that I need mercy, or I've just come out of a situation where I needed mercy big time, and then my daughter acts up and disobeys. It's different if my wife treats me in a way I don't want to be treated, But I just did that and recognized my need for mercy. But if I'm feeling self-righteous and good and I get cut off, then that's when I don't act with mercy. And so we have to be mindful of the end, I feel like, with this one. We've got to desire mercy so that we can then be merciful. When he says that, I'm sure there are a lot of people on the mountain who are like, I don't need mercy, I haven't done anything wrong. And Jesus says, exactly. But one day you're going to need it, and you've shown none. Verse 8, he says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. He's saying, I want you to desire inner purity over outer purity. Because that's what Judaism was so caught up in at the time. We'll bring the kingdom if we can just do everything right on the outside. And so the Pharisees would walk around, and if they saw a woman come down the road, they'd close their eyes. And they were known for walking into walls over this. It was an outward form of righteousness that had nothing to do with what was happening in their hearts. And it didn't have anything to do with bringing the kingdom. And Jesus says, the pure in heart, the ones who inside are clean, are the ones who see God. And that reminds me where Jesus tells the Pharisees, if you wash the inside of the cup, the outside would be clean too. But instead, all you do is keep spending your time cleaning the outside of it, while inside, it's just dirty and messy and gross. We've got to desire inner purity and not just outer purity so that it looks good. Blessed are the peacemakers, the people who work for peace around them. Peace in the Bible, shalom was the idea, had to do with may everything in your world be right. And so that means that we work for the peace and the rightness of the people at work. May the things in their lives be right. Because they're the ones who are called sons of God. That was an identification. They are God's people because they're like Him. And the last one, where he calls us to desire what's best, he says, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It's because they side with doing what's right. I know at times it's easy to just kind of turn a blind eye and act like you didn't see something that someone was doing or saying. I know me in particular because I'm not big on confrontation. But he's saying, blessed are those who are persecuted because they side with what's right and say, you know what? Regardless of the consequences, I'm going to stay on that side. Because the kingdom is theirs. But I think the focus of this whole thing is in verse 11. Because he switches from saying theirs, for theirs is, for they are, because he switches and says, blessed are you when others revile you. That means when they talk bad and find fault with you, pointing out everything they can to shame you, and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely. Not true things, but false things. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. He says they're doing it because you identify with me. And this is what this makes me think of. Lately, there's a football player that is constantly mocked because he identifies with Jesus. He's not my cup of tea. He and I might not ever be friends. We might do things a little bit differently. But Tim Tebow is constantly mocked because he says, hey, you know what? I'm Jesus, and Jesus is mine. And that's what this is talking about. Is this a guy who just says, you know what? Regardless of the consequences, this is who I am, and this is what my life is about. You don't have to like me for this or for that, but this is who I am, and this is what my life is about. And now that I say that, I'm afraid, because a lot of the time, celebrity athletes fall. And they really destroy their testimony. But it's an example right now of somebody who is shamed and reviled and mocked falsely because he identifies with Jesus. And Jesus is saying, disciples, this is the good life. Your reward in heaven will be great if you identify with me. So the whole point of the Beatitudes is Jesus is saying, here's the good life. You would think about going this way. You're going to be tempted over the years of you following me to go off in this way and start to think, I'll get comfort over here, or I'll get security over here, or I'll bring in the kingdom if I work harder this way. And Jesus says, no, the good life is this direction. Just like you started in mourning over your sin, just like you started being merciful, just like you started with a hunger and thirst for righteousness. You've got to continue with that, and you've got to identify with me. I feel like we can make the discipleship so complicated because we think, oh, you got to do this and this and this and this, and you got to do. And Jesus says, the way you start is the way you continue, is the way you finish. The Beatitudes set that up. And when I look at this, I made two lists. I made a column of what the good life was, and I made a column of what Jesus says is the blessed, the good life. And I was thinking how we all pursue that good life, but we have this other way that we go. But if we look at Jesus' life, he always goes straight for the people in the left-hand column. He always goes straight to the poor in spirit. He always goes straight for those who mourn. He always goes straight for the people who are pure in heart rather than pure in body. He always goes straight for the people who have been hungering and thirsting for righteousness for their whole life, and they finally found it in bodily form. And Jesus is saying, if you're a disciple, you're going to walk with me in that way, and you're going to be in that column, and I'm going to head straight for you every time. It would be a mistake if I just assumed that everybody here was a Christian, that everybody here was already a disciple. But what I've been alluding to here, this process of discipleship, is true for starting with Jesus. It starts with a recognition that all of my good deeds are as filthy rags before God, and I will never be able to be, I will never see Him, I will never come into His presence, I will never be identified as one of His kids, unless He comes to me. And then as we mourn over sin and say, God, we look at this the way you look at it, we want what you want, we're going to walk in your way, and then it's in trusting and identifying with Jesus as the only way to come to God. And so what I've been preaching to us, the rest of us as disciples, is true for people who have never started with Christ, who would be like the other people on the mountain, just sitting there listening and going, I don't know about this. But it's the good life. It doesn't mean, hey, right now everything's going to be great. But it's the good life. One of my interests since middle school has been, when I was in middle school, I thought I was going to be a Navy SEAL one day. And so ever since then, I watch the movies and read the books. And I was reading a book this week about the training they go through, which is pretty much the most brutal that we know of. I mean, there's probably more brutal things done by dictators in Africa, but the most brutal thing done to people voluntarily in the free world. And the commanding officer sat down with the guys before they started, and he said, guys, this is what you'll get if you finish. You'll get a great job, a great career, training. You'll get buddies for life. You'll be a part of a brotherhood. You'll be able to travel. You'll do something worthwhile with your lives. But there's a price to pay. And you're the one who decides if the reward is worth the cost. He said, every day you're going to have to decide that during this training. The reward is great, but the cost is great too. Will you pay it? And when we think about our discipleship, we can't control what's going to happen tomorrow, the next week, the week after that. But right now we can say, you know what? Jesus says this is the good life, and I'm going to count the cost, and I'm going to leave off all of those other things that I'd started to veer away towards, thinking that would give me comfort and mercy, that would bring me into the kingdom, that would be what would help me see God. We can say, you know what, the good life is worth it. And so I'm going to reevaluate today. I'm going to reevaluate this week and make sure that I'm continuing the way I started with Jesus. Will you evaluate and throw off everything that stands against Jesus? Will you return to the start and continue with need and trust and a tight clinging to Jesus? Or for some of you, will you start with Jesus? So what's the difference? If we obey this passage, what happens? I always ask myself of that question of a passage, especially of a sermon. Okay, what happens? If we obey this passage, we'll deserve to be called Christians. But because we'll have continued in the way of Jesus, always in that left-hand column, and He's always come straight at us. And if we obey this passage, We will give Bloomington Normal a tangible definition for Christians and a physical reference for Jesus. If we return to the start and continue with need and trust and a clinging to Jesus, we will give Bloomington Normal a tangible definition for Jesus. A tangible definition for Christians and a physical reference of what Jesus is like. So the people there in Western Bloomington know what it's like to be given mercy. Know what it's like to, you know what, give up everything else we could have gone for and instead pursue poverty of spirit. And if we obey this, we will get the reward. We will get the good life that Jesus was talking about. Okay, we're going to pray. I want you to think about this passage. I want you to think about the good life, the reward that's out there, and the cost that we pay to get there. We're going to sing a song, and I don't know how you normally handle an invitation. It might mean you pray in your seats. You might decide to pray up here. You might decide to talk with me or Bill or one of the other deacons. But my hope for this is that all of us evaluate and say, you know what, I'm going to go back to the beginning. I'm going to walk in the way I did at the beginning with Jesus. Let's pray. God, we love you. We thank you that your word always points us to Jesus and it always steers us right. And I pray that your word would convict us. Convict us of the ways that we have veered away from your way and started to take on the values of our culture. I pray that as we return to identifying and clinging to and trusting Jesus, that you would use us as a light, as a lighthouse to the people here. So they say, you know what, that's what Jesus is like. It's got to be what he's like. Amen.